week on Sources, we turn our attention to the stories history almost forgot. For decades, the lives of incarcerated women in colonial British Guiana existed only in fragments, buried in punishment logs, hospital registers, and fading prison records. They were present but unheard, documented but rarely understood. But what happens when those silences are broken, when the archive is re-examined and those lives are brought back into focus? Our guest today is helping to do exactly that. Dr. Estherine Adams, Guyanese scholar and head of the Department of History and Caribbean Studies at the University of Guyana, is bringing these hidden histories to the center of our understanding. Her work challenges how we think about power, punishment, labor, and the experiences of women who have long been left out of the historical records. Her latest book, Slavery, Indentureship, and Women's Labor, Early British Guiana's Jails, is already reshaping how we understand the past and how it connects to the present. I'm Svetlana Marshall, and this is Sources. Welcome to Sources. Tonight, we're turning back the pages of history with Guyanese scholar and head of the Department of History and Caribbean Studies at the University of Guyana, Dr. Estherine Adams. Dr. Adams, welcome to Sources.
Thank you, Svetlana, for having me.
Dr. Adams, before we get into talking about your book, your latest edition, tell us what drew you to history in the first place.
Well, I never did history in high school. A lot of people are surprised to know that I picked it up later. But when I went to CPC, I remember I had the option of either choosing English or social studies as my option. And yeah, English is okay, but I said, you know what, social studies, that's easy. So let me choose social studies, not understanding that social studies was not just social studies as you knew it in high school, but social studies was a combination of social studies, history, and geography. And I remember my very first history class, and the tutor was a woman by the name of Nibert Haynes. I think she was one of those Guyana scholars back in the days. And she stood in front of this class and she was just talking. And we as the class, we thought that this woman was just talking. This woman was given an entire lesson. I think it was something about Europe in the 15th century or something like that. And she just stood there and she commanded this room and she was able to teach this class without any reference material or anything. And I was completely blown away. Like, I couldn't understand what she was doing. And so I think that is what really captivated me, that initial introduction to history from Miss Nibert Haynes at CPC. And so I started, because you had an option now of, what are you going to major in? It's social studies in general, but then you could focus on a particular area. And so I decided, I think then the decision was made that, you know what, I'm going to focus on history, because history, a lot of times when we think about it as, just some boring thing, lots of names, lots of dates, lots of old white people, and so on. But history is so much more than that. And she brought that history to life, and it captivated me ever since that time.
What specific aspect of Guyanese history influenced you even greater?
Oh, Guyanese history is fascinating, right? Because there's so much that has happened over the years, right? From settlement and how we changed hands and all of that. But I think it would have to be, without a doubt, the period of enslavement in Guyana, because that in itself, I mean, our ancestors were enslaved under the Dutch, and that system, operated in a particular way, and then they switched hands to the French for a short period of time, and then to the British. And so there's so much that happened throughout that period, And I guess what is so fascinating though is the resilience of enslaved people throughout this period, right? They never gave up. They didn't all rise up in rebellions like, you know, the 1763 or the 1823 or anything like that. But throughout the period, they continued to resist the system in ways that they could. All right, it could be something small, and sometimes we look at those things and we don't think that, you know, those are important because those are just minor, but those were, you know, important to them because it helped them to survive that system, to be resilient, to come out of that system. Imagine coming out of a system of slavery and being able the following year to buy yourself an entire village. How is that even possible? And that, you know, that kind of blows my mind to think, because of course a system of slavery is not a system where you're being compensated for your labor. No. You're working, and you have to, these enslaved people had to find alternative ways of earning money. All right, and they were able to do that to the point that they were able, and what you see happening here in Guyana, where coming out of slavery, enslaved people were able to buy like Victoria and the other villages. You don't see that in any other Caribbean territory. As a matter of fact, in any other place that you had a systematic or a general system of slavery, you don't see anything like that. So that in itself is, you know, quite fascinating about what enslaved people in the Guyana colonies were able to accomplish. All right. And so that in itself, the whole system and how it operated and how they were able to move and navigate this system and to come out, you know, that would have to be the aspect of this history that captivates me the most.
Now, you've taken a decision, in a sense, to focus on women incarcerated during the colonial British Guiana period. Why? What led you to that point?
Well, I guess I have lots of stories to say to talk about tonight. But this journey began around, I would say, maybe like about 2015. And I had just started at UG as a lecturer, and a professor from the University of Leicester, she was doing some work on the Mazaruni penal settlement, and another colleague from UG, Dr. Eiffel, met her at a conference, and she's like, you know, you're from Leicester talking about what happening in Mazaruni, you know, I'm from Guyana, this is our place, and so on. And basically invited her down to come and to talk about the research that she was doing. Now, what that morphed into was what we call a seed grant, a very small grant. To see what was here, you know, if there is anything that we could do, expand this study of prisons and the penal system, because up to that time, we didn't have any historical studies of the prison system in Guyana. You had a couple of contemporary works that look at different aspects of the system, like recidivism and those kinds of things, but nothing historic. Where this system emerged from? Did this thing just happen to be there, you know? How did it come about? So she came down and we started with the Georgetown prison. A general overview of the Georgetown prison. What is there about, is there enough evidence? Is there enough material that we can expand it? There was enough material, and so we expanded that project into something larger, looking at mental health, neurological disorders, and substance abuse in Guyana's jails. A complete study of all the jails in Guyana. And so I was a researcher on that project, and basically in the archives collected material. But what I realized there is that all the material that we're collecting, men of course are centered because they made up the larger part of the prison population, as is normal, all right? But every so often there are these women emerging, there are names of these women. And so when we did our final report, again, most of what we were talking about, it was generalized, but in such a way that men were seen as the norm, you know. So we focused on, you know, how men entered into the system, how it punished them, and that kind of thing. But no specific focus on these women. But you have all of these women scattered throughout the years in this system. So when we started tabulating, like how many persons are incarcerated per year, now you looking at the stats, and I realized that this is the period that you have the most women incarcerated, and I'm talking about if we look at Guyana presently, like modern Guyana, contemporary Guyana, and if we look at the Guyana colonies back then, this is the period you had like at one time about 11,000 women incarcerated for a particular year. You don't have that any other time, not even today, you don't have that a number of women being incarcerated. So somebody got to talk about these women, all right? They're there and they're doing things. They're not just there as passive victims in a system. They're navigating this system. They're trying to live in the system that isn't designed for them, right? And so that kind of drove me. We got to give these women a voice. Too often in a lot of what we do, women are just, on the back burners. There's not much focus on them and what they're doing, especially in such a kind of institutionalized system like the penal system, because men, as I said, dominates the system, and so we tend to forget and relegate these women to the footnotes of history. And so I task myself I give myself the task of giving voice to these women.
So you started by doing a single piece, and then you blossom into pieces, and then a book. So let's talk about the first set of pieces that you did before we get to the book.
So in 2018, I had the opportunity of going to university to grad school to get my PhD done. And one of the things, when you're applying, you have to let them know, what is it that you're going to come to do, so that they can tell you, well, we have somebody that's going to be there to advise you, or, we'll need to find somebody. And so I'm thinking, what am I going to do? Because the two options that I had was either women or children, because there were quite a number of children that were also entangled in the penal system at the time. And so I'm there debating between women and children, and women won. All right.
Because I guess because of the significant number of women, 11,000 in one given year is a lot.
It's a lot, right? But also because the person that I wanted to work with at the university, she was a gender and sexuality historian. So I know that would appeal a little bit more to her than children. And I still plan to do that work at some time. I have so many plans, but so I decided, what, I'm gonna stick with the women, and I started on that journey, looking at the women, and that ended up blossoming into. As a matter of fact, I did the article first, and kind of built out that article into what eventually became the dissertation, that eventually became the manuscript that will become the book now.
The book. And you went on also to win several awards. You won, you were a recipient of the Ghana Prize for Literature, as well as the ASSLH Edna Ryan Prize, if I got that correctly. How those two awards came about? You applied?
All right. So the Edna Ryan Prize, that one was a complete shock to me, because I didn't submit my work for that. I submitted that article that I was talking about. It was at home, at work, or in goal, because the colonial officials, that was their mantra in the Guyana context. They would say that an immigrant should be in one of three places at any given time: at home, at work, in hospital, or in goal, or in, which is the term that they use to describe the jail. Yeah. So an immigrant should have been in any one of those three places. And so I was focusing on the immigration period, which is that 1838 to about 1917, 1838, when East Indian immigrants started arriving, and of course emancipation, and 1917 when the system ends. So I did that piece. I submitted it to the Journal of Labor History, because it was really focusing on their labor, how the labor was used. And I submitted that to the Journal of Labor History, and it was published, and I was happy because
that was it.
I had a publication. And so last December, I remember it was a Sunday because I was just home from church, and just scrolling my phone, and I saw this email like you're the congratulations, you're the winner, and I'm like, congratulations. I automatically thought that it was maybe some scam or something. You know, somebody always sending you something trying to scam you. So I'm like, I didn't enter anything. What am I winning? I didn't enter my work in anywhere. So I said, you know what? Let me just, check this thing out and see if it's legitimate. And it was. Then because I found all the information, then they wrote again, giving me more information and so on. So that particular prize, that to me was very meaningful because it wasn't a case where I sought it out, but a case where my work was out there and persons looked at it and realized the significance of that work and how important it was enough to adjudge it, the winner of this kind of prize, talking about its importance to labor history. So that one was particularly significant for me. For the Guyana Prize, I entered my manuscript into that one. I was going to enter, but then saw this little note at the end of the whole thing that if you're a Guyanese living in Guyana, you could enter a manuscript. And I'm like, you know what? I have a manuscript. Why not enter it? Because I was already thinking about publishing, and I said this would be a good opportunity to kind of feel what the kind of response would be to the work. And so I said I'm going to enter it, and at least I will get some kind of response, some kind of feedback from the judges, like, okay, this isn't, you could work on these areas, you can improve it in this way, and so on. And I honestly didn't submit it thinking that it would actually win. And the response that I got, it was tremendous. And the kind of feedback that I got, because that manuscript was titled The Few Among the Many: Women's Labor in British Guiana's Jails, 1838 to 1917. Very long title. And a piece of the feedback that I got was to change the title of the work and make it a little bit more focused and a little bit more structured, and which will make it more appealing. And I did that, and this to this new title that it now has. All right, and I think that was perhaps the best recommendation that I got, because the kind of feedback that I'm getting, just the title alone, right? Because the title now is Slavery, Indentureship, and Women's Labor, because it tells you exactly what it's focusing on. And maybe like about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got a call from some colleagues at the Liverpool Museum, Slavery Museum, and they're doing a project on liberated African immigrants. And they're asking me, do you want to come on this, because we see that you do work on indenture. All right. And had I not changed that, all right, it would have been a lot more difficult to make that connection between my work and indentureship and these kinds of connections. And so that is what I was expecting when I entered it for the Guyana Prize, that whatever feedback that I got, that I was going to be able to incorporate it and to make this work a better work. And I think that I was able to do that.
Congratulations to you.
Thank you.
You're doing great. Now let's talk about that book that you've now published, Slavery, Indentureship, Women's Labor, Early British Guiana's Jails. What are some of the key findings that you were able to incorporate into that book to make it what it is today, and to set the record straight, and to ensure that women are seen and heard and their voices are heard even to this day?
Right. I like that, because I love talking about my work. I'm sorry. I'm very passionate about what I do, and I love to talk about it. So, slavery, indentureship, and women's labor. It exactly as the name says, that's the period that it covers. So I begin at with the Dutch period of settlement, and what I do is in that first chapter of the book, what I try to do is to show that there was always a penal kind of system in place within the colony. All right? And I guess the overarching argument of the book is that you have all of these people incarcerated, but you're not incarcerating them because they are criminals and they're committing these heinous crimes. You're incarcerating them because this is another avenue for you to capture their labor and to use it.
Use them.
All right. And so what I do in the first in that first chapter, I show that you had a prison, you had a system. All right. But the power to punish, because it was during the period of slavery, was in the hands of the plantation owners. So on individual plantations, you had what they call hospitals, or sick houses, but they weren't in the traditional sense. They were more kind of like a jail, all right, that they would use if an enslaved person misbehave or whatever, they will send them to the hospital or that sick house, all right, as punishment. But the plantation owner had that authority to do that because the enslaved person was his property. But then, if they committed like a capital crime, what we'll consider a capital crime, like running away from the plantation or killing somebody, enslaved or white, then they would be sent to the colony's workhouse, which is the earliest iteration of what a prison or a jail would be. So they were sent to the workhouses, and in the workhouses, they were under the authority of the colonial administration. All right? And so the aim of incarcerating people then, or putting them in those prison systems at the time, was literally to punish them for whatever infraction they may have committed, for if it was running away, whatever they did, or if it was being involved in a rebellion, whatever it was, the aim in that slavery period was to punish them. It wasn't to extract their labor, because
they were
the labor was already
there. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, in this post-emancipation period now, enslaved people are free.
Yeah.
Free. All right? And so they now have a certain amount of control over their labor because they are free people. And so they can choose whether they want to provide this labor for the particular plantation or not. All right? They can't be compelled to provide labor. They decide when and where and how they want to provide that labor. So for a very short period of time, they had that kind of autonomy over their labor. But then, of course, the colonial officials and the plantocracy, being who they were, because they lost that control, they tried to reassert their control by, of course, immigration. And so they start bringing these immigrants in and flooding the labor market as a means of controlling the labor. But they still want these formerly enslaved people, these free people, to be a part of this labor force. All right, because remember when immigrants come in, they're coming in fresh and new. They're not accustomed to the system. They have to learn to work within the system, and they have to do all of these things. But you have these Creoles, because by that time they were referred to as Creoles, as originating within the colony, and you have them here already knowing the right, all right, knowing the ins and outs of the system, but and they're choosing when they want to work or when they don't want to work. So incarceration now becomes a tool of driving them back onto the plantation
for free labor.
Good, because the laws in this post-emancipation period, all of these laws now change and become more complicated. So things like vagrancy becomes a crime. So you can't just be loitering around anywhere. It's now a crime. Being insolent and petty theft and things that they would not have charged you with before. All of these things now become criminal. All right? And so if you violate any of those, then you're sentenced to jail.
And they were sentenced like for what period? Like a month, 2 months, a year?
That's the thing, right? Two things. One, you're sentenced to jail, but you're sentenced to jail with hard labor. So not just sentenced to jail. You're not just going in there with hard labor. That's what your sentence would say. But the length of the sentences were very short. All right, it could be a 3 months, a 6 months, a 1 year was perhaps except it was like a criminal offense or something that you got a longer period for. But all the others, it was very short periods, a month, a 3-month period. And you found that immigrants in particular were subjected to that kind of incarceration. And so, so that's what I try to show, that now in this post-emancipation period, the idea behind incarcerating these women or these people in general, it wasn't about punishing them for the crimes that they're committed,
but getting them
it's
to work.
because you can now harness that labor. This labor now becomes malleable, so you can now mold it and fashion it and move it how you want, to the way you were able to do during the period of slavery, that you're no longer able to do with the formerly enslaved people, unless you drive them into this other system. So the prison now kind of becomes an extension of the plantation, because the same systems of control in place operated within that prison system.
What were some of the hard labor to term it, as they termed it, women were asked to do or demanded to do?
All right, so before, if you were sentenced to hard labor prior to the immigration period, for example, hard labor would be things like work. And this is why I can argue that, this thing in the pre-period, it wasn't about extracting labor. Hard labor then meant turning a crank, literally unproductive labor. So you were expected to make 200 revolutions. So you sat wherever they put you and you just turn this crank for no reason. Or they had these huge iron balls that you will pick them up from here and you will take them over there, and then pick them up from there and bring them back over here. Or there was a treadmill and you would just hold on and you would just walk.
That's what hard labor constituted.
That was what hard labor was. In this post-emancipation period now, hard labor was, let's say immigrants, for example. An immigrant, you're on the plantation, you violated some labor law, you were sent to prison or to the jail. Now what they did, they will take you and send you to work on a plantation that was close to the jail. And so you will work, if you were sentenced to 1 month, then you would work your 1 month on that plantation. And then you went back to your original plantation. When you go back to your original plantation, the time that you spent incarcerated working on some other plantation, you had to work that time back for your original plantation before your contract could be considered expired. All right? For Creole incarcerated people, most of them ended up working on the seawall, building this granite seawall as we know it now. Because a lot of times when we think about that, we think about, the Dutch built the seawalls. The Dutch didn't build this granite structure that is there. The Dutch built, they reclaimed the land and they built mud dams that kept the sea from encroaching onto the land. But this granite structure that you see there, they used the prisoners, especially those from Georgetown jail, and they will take them out there, and that is what they did. And I literally found the labor book, because they would record, what labor the people were doing, and they found pages of the book, fragments of it, and it said, what did they call him? Not the foreman. I don't remember the name that he was called, but he was requesting 35 women from the Georgetown jail to work on the seawall, or he was requesting how many ever women to work on the seawall. And so these women were involved in the actual labor. Now, what at the beginning of every chapter of the book, what I did was to introduce a woman to the reader. And one of I think it's probably the introduction, or maybe chapter 1, I can't remember. But I introduced an indentured woman called Basanta. And her mother wrote the governor, appealing to him for her to come, to send her back. She was from Essequibo. And I don't know what, because it didn't say what she did, but whatever crime she committed, they sent her to serve her sentence at the Georgetown jail. And her mother talked about seeing her being marched to the seawall to work, and you know how she described how she looked and so on. And based on that, she was asking the governor to please send her back to Essequibo and send her to work on a plantation that was close to her, because that is more in keeping with the kind of labor that she was expected to perform. So clearly, this labor that these women were performing at the seawall, they also did public works like road works. They were sent to other government institutions. So there's talk about sending them to clean the rifle ranges.
So there wasn't any variation or difference between the work the hard labor men did and women did, no?
So there's an entire chapter just on that. All right, because what I argue is that what the colonial officials were trying, and the plantocracy, what they were trying to do is to defeminize or masculinize these women. All right, so I argue that these men and women basically share the same accommodation. So if they were at the Georgetown jail, all of them were at Georgetown jail. They were sleeping in separate quarters. So there was a section for men and section for women, but they were all there. There was not a designated women prison at the time. All right. In the 1870s, they would open. There was one at Fellowship. I don't know if you know where Fellowship is. It's across the river. So there was one there. It was originally a men prison. And apparently it was a terrible prison, because one of the arguments for not turning it into a woman's prison was that the men feared going to Fellowship, so you could keep it as a method of control, of, you know, threatening to send them to Fellowship. But eventually they converted Fellowship into a woman's prison. So that was the first in the 1870s. And the only reason for that is because the population at the Georgetown prison had become so large that they could not be contained there anymore, and so they had to find an alternative accommodation for them. But on to that time, because within this period that I'm talking about, 1838 to 1970, you had 11 permanent prison locations in just on the coast.
Oh, wow.
All right, so there were prisons at in Essequibo, you had at Suddy, you had Wakenham had one, Best, Fellowship, Georgetown, Mahaica, New Amsterdam, Marijuana. Yeah, a couple other, and then you had what they call temporary prisons too. So they will, you know, and then there was a convict depot at Kingston, of course, and all of them, if you notice, the location of all of them is along the coastal plain, where all the sugar plantations are also concentrated. So, I mean, it's clear that this is what they're setting them up for, so that they can service these plantations. Mazaruni was the only exception, because Mazaruni was a penal settlement, and the aim for Mazaruni, the aim was different. It was there for persons convicted of capital offenses, serving very long periods of incarceration. Then you would send them to, so like your rape and murder and so on. Then you would send them to Mazaruni. But everybody else was contained in these sites.
Did you find evidence of women resisting this hard labor? And if so, how did they resist?
Oh, yes, the women did not just, and you know, this is one of the things that's so heartening to see, that they didn't just, you know, take it as it was. And the thing about doing this kind of history is the kind of records, the kind of material that we have to work with. A lot of the material are official documents, like the prison reports and the letters to the governor, and, you know, those official documents. And none of those documents are created with the aim of talking about the agency or anything of the incarcerated people. These are official records aimed at providing information for the official colonial office. But one of the things that as historians we learn to do is what we call reading against the bias grain, because all of these documents are inherently biased because of how they are created. And so we have to read against the bias grain. So how do we do that? you will read punishment records. What does punishment records tell you? Not that the woman was she was punished. It tells us that these women are resisting. Why? What other reason would you be punished other than resisting? So this is one of the ways in which we are able to recapture that resistance by reading these punishments record. So you see in the record to talk about how many of them are running away from the or are escaping from the prison. How many of them are talking? They're being punished for what? What are they being punished for? Talking back to the prison officials. They're these kinds of things. Another way we see or we're able to read resistance. How many of them are in solitary confinement? All right, because these women are being sent to solitary confinement, or how many of them are being put on what they call punishment diet of bread and water only. All right, and so that is how we're able to see that yes, these women are resistant. There was this there are two very interesting cases that I came across, and one is about this woman that, because one of the things that happened, women with children, you would have to take your children to the jail with you.
Oh, wow.
All right. So that wasn't an excuse for not serving a sentence. So there are lots of cases, and I talk about them in the book. Lots of cases of these women going into the prison with their children. Even the reports, like because you had the chaplains and so on that will go to the prison and minister to them. And in one of the chaplains' report, he talks about baptizing these infants and so on. So which of course means that they are in the system. So there's this particular woman, and she was working on the seawall, and how we came to know of this case is that the officer that tried to apprehend her, he was petitioning the governor for payment for his role in what he was doing. And she had a child in jail, but she was working on the seawall, and she probably saw an opportunity, and she just decided, you know what, I'm just going to run. And so the governor couldn't understand, because he said something like this. He can't believe this woman well, I'm paraphrasing because this is not his direct word, but he's like, I can't believe this woman would run away and leave her child in the jail. All right. So I think we might be judging her very harshly from our 2026 point of view, but imagine the kind of conditions that you had to be experiencing and being subjected to, that you saw this opportunity and the only thing you can think about is just leaving. All right. I don't think she forgot that she had a child there, but she probably reasoned that, nothing bad will become of the child. They'll probably take the child out and send her to the orphan asylum or something like that. All right, but what these conditions were like, that this was her most visceral reaction to having an opportunity to escape. And I talk a lot about that. What these conditions were like for them as they were in this prison system.
Those conditions, did they lead to death? Were you able to capture data on maybe the number of women who died within the system due to the hard labor, not because of illness
So we're able to, but the reports, how they will structure the reports. So there's a section that talks about death, but they don't separate it by gender.
Okay.
So it's not easy to tell unless you read the medical official's reports. And sometimes in those reports, he might have a particular case that was noteworthy enough for him to mention, and so we have like a general sense of how many persons died. Unless they died by suicide, because they did, you did have people dying by suicide. So unless that was the case, because they will separate that from dying by natural causes, as they termed it. And other than that, it's very difficult for us to tell, how many of them were actually women and how many of them were actually men.
Listening to you, I could tell that it wasn't easy, retrieving this information, and much less, piecing it together Tell me about that process.
Oh gosh, that is a very heavy process that, as historians, we have to grapple with. I think the my first case that I had to leave the archives for a couple of days was a case of a very young girl. She was a girl. She was I think she was like what 12 or 13 years old at the time of her incarceration, and that one messed me up for a couple of days. You have to leave documents, you have to go do something else, just something to kind of reorient yourself, and to because it's a lot of heavy material that you're dealing with, and processing some of that, even though these are people that were there a very long time ago. Sometimes we think that, oh, because it's like ancient history, right? But these are real people. These are our ancestors. We don't even know. Sometimes that's my direct ancestor or something. I don't know that, all right? But reading how they experienced the system and the things that they went through, oh my God. Then the second one, this one was so devastating. It was this enslaved woman that was pregnant, and she was heavily pregnant on a Berbice plantation and couldn't do the work. It was a cotton plantation, and so she had to stand and she had to pick the cotton, and she couldn't do the work, and the overseer ordered that she be flogged.
Wow.
And she was heavily, almost ready to deliver, pregnant. And the driver that was assigned to flog her, he initially refused, but then, because of the position that he was in, he was forced into flogging her, and they flogged her, and she ended up going into labor. And the testimony from the midwife, she testified about how the baby was born, and the baby's arms were broken, and the baby had a laceration across its head, and that kind of thing, right? And so the inherent violence in this archive it's sometimes it just blows your mind, and you have to take some time, because if you just immerse yourself in this kind of material all the time, it has an effect on you as well, right? So that, learning to grapple with it, learning to deal with that level of violence on such an intimate level, that took some getting used to. And I guess I was happy that persons before me were able to talk about it, write about it, how to deal with these kinds of things, and that helped, all right? But still having to deal with it on a personal level was really hard for most of the time.
And looking back now, being able to tell their stories and extract the information to give true representation of what really took place in those prison cells and how labor was extracted, you're satisfied that you were able to execute, notwithstanding challenges, this particular book.
I mean, I'm to a point I am, but maybe dissatisfied in the sense that I too had to choose. There was no way for me to, at that point, to represent all of these women. The material that I use for this book is not half of the material that I have collected. So I had to make those choices, like which of these. It's like me saying, well, you are more important than you are, or your story is more captivating than yours. And not, I guess that kind of bothered me a bit, having to make those kinds of decisions and having to decide whose story is going to be told and whose is still going to remain kind of hidden, for at least for the while. That was a little bit difficult, not being able, because you want to tell all the stories, but it's not practical, right? You got to admit that it's not practical for you to do that, in at least not in the form of a monograph or in the form of a book. It's not practical. unless it's going to be encyclopedic. But having to make that decision, those decisions of whose story is going to be told and who's going to be left there, that was a little bit hard as well, right? But it's a decision that had to ultimately be made. It's like tell some or not being able to tell any at all.
Would you like to see this book incorporated into our school's curriculum, where we talk not only about slavery in British Guyana in the way it was written or it came across originally, but to reflect what truly happened? And this is really an eye-opener, because I was thinking, you know what? She's writing about women in prison, like why, you know? What is there to be said? But then to understand truly the way they were used, in a sense, enslaved again, to, regardless of the period, regardless if it's 1 day, 2 days, or a month, the fact that they were used and their labor used in that sense for free labor, because it meant that now they're cutting down on their labor costs, because they use thousands of women and men to work on those plantations. And so I guess they found many, many reasons to incarcerate them. And so that is very important. Would you want to see history, your book, become part of that list of books taught in schools?
I would hope so, because I framed it in the sense that it talks about what I call the other unfree labor. Because when we think about slavery and indentureship, we think about it sort of like on a binary.
Yeah.
So there's slavery, unfree labor, and there's indentureship, free labor, in the sense that the laborers are here because they made that choice, even though there was a level of coercion in that choice, but they're being paid for that labor. So there's free labor with slavery, there is paid labor with indentureship. But what my intervention in this historiography is that between these two, in this binary, there is this other unfree labor, and this is these incarcerated people, where you send them there and you use their labor. They're not compensated. The prison administration is compensated, because that's part of the argument, that they're able to offset the cost of running the prisons from the labor of the incarcerated people. But you have this other unfree labor, all right? And so I want students of history, readers in general, to think about that. Think about, when you think about the whole system, all right, not look at it in that binary, that slavery was free labor, indentureship is paid labor, but that there is this other labor that was there as well.
What connections do you see between these colonial systems in British Guyana and modern institutions? Do you see anything?
There are lots that is still there. That, a lot of these systems still, a lot of the colonial systems still underpin these modern Guyanese systems. If we look at something like our parliament or laws, we still operate within that, you know, that framework that was handed down to us. Even though, yes, we were emancipated, we got independence and we made some changes, but the framework remained the same. And even in the prisons, because that study that I told you about that we did, that larger study, that was one of the findings, that even the buildings, all right, at Mazaruni or at Georgetown before the fire or at New Amsterdam, all of those buildings were, or parts of them were the original structures that were built way back when. So a lot of what we do today, a lot of it is still premised on what we inherited from our colonial past.
What do you hope readers would take away from your book when they read it?
I want them to see that this Guyanese history that we read a lot of times and that we hear about a lot of times, that it's not this you know, this static thing. It's not this one story that, oh, we were in a colonial past, enslaved, indentureship, independence, and we kind of move along that linear scale, right? But there's so many branches to all of that, and I want people to see that this history is not this clean cut thing that we talk about, but it's messy, and it's, you know, there are all of these other dimensions to it that we should explore.
When you look at Guyanese and Caribbean history, and given what you've been able to unearth, what are some of the gaps? What are some of the missing pieces? What are some of the areas you believe ought to be revisited, to be told in the correct sense?
I mean, we could start from the beginning, right? Because a lot of the older history that we have on Guyana, most of it was written by, the Europeans. And of course, they presented it in a Eurocentric form. So their ideas. So if you read, I'm talking about like the Broadways and so on. If you read that, because my Guyanese history students at UG, those are the books that I have them read, because I want them to get an understanding of how these narratives that we hold on to, how these narratives were formed. And then what we try to do now is to disrupt these narratives, all right? So you will read, for example, in 1838, in 1834, after the abolition of slavery, and the governor addressing the people, and he's telling them how they're lazy and they're this and they're that. I mean, come on, right? How do we read that? Is it a case where these people refuse to do what you want them to do, and so suddenly they become lazy and they become insolent and so on? These are the same people who are working all of these hours, all of this time, and you didn't have that kind of thing to say. And so we have to, all right, we have to revisit a lot of that older history that is there, and to write this history from our perspective, from our understanding, because a lot more is done on the contemporary side. Most people write about the contemporary history of Guyana, especially the 70s and the 80s and the 60s and so on. But hardly anybody wants to go back that far, which is understandable, because a lot of the archives that you have to work with is in manuscript form, and having to read that handwriting, and so it's not easy. It's very, very difficult. It takes a very long time. I mean, the technology now helps with the transcribing and so it makes it a lot faster. But we have to go back and we have to tell this story of our Guyana as Guyanese, and not have other people tell our story for us.
Now, looking at the curriculum in the school's curriculum dealing with history, like you rightfully said, it's important for us to maybe revisit some areas. What recommendation you would put forward? Like, what do you see that ought to be addressed as a matter of importance and for correctness?
On the Guyanese aspect of it, we don't know Guyanese history. We don't teach Guyanese history I'm sure your first experience with Guyanese history would have been when you went to UG. Other than in your CSEC syllabus, that you probably talk about.
We did Caribbean history.
You did Caribbean history, but they focus on the 1763 Bourbon Rebellion and the 1823 Demerara Rebellion, and Indentureship are probably the only, and then maybe later on with the independence movements and so on. If you did that theme, because of course you could select what theme you want to do. There is not enough focus on Guyanese history, right? I think a little while ago, bishops used to do Guyanese history, maybe forms 1 to 3. I think they did Guyanese history, and then they transitioned to Caribbean history or something like that. None of these schools do Guyanese.
You think we should definitely go back?
Social studies is enough that covers all of that. Social studies is not history. It's an aspect of history is in the social studies syllabus. But I think as Guyanese, we have to know and understand our history. The children can't know and understand the history unless it is taught to them. All right? And so the best place to do that is in the schools. I can't think of any other school system, any place where the students don't do their country's history. If you go to the US, they have to do US history. Venezuela, all of them, they have to. That's why all of them know from a very early age that Esquerro belongs to Venezuela. Because that's what they're taught as part of their history. We don't have that same kind of orientation and socialization. We don't know. Ask the average person when the arbitration treaty was signed. They don't know. All right, and those are important things. It helps us to develop a proper identity something that we can hold on to. That's why it's easy. I think that's why it's so easy for us to assume all of these different identities. You know, wherever we go, we easily pick up if it's the accents or the mannerisms and so on. It's easy for us to do because we don't have a proper grounding in our history.
So you feel that we ought to go back to that?
I feel strongly that at every level of the education system, nursery, primary, and secondary, I mean at tertiary we do it, it's there, but it's not, and even at the UG we're still trying to get it to be like one of those service courses like English that everybody must do, rather than like you had an option to choose whether you want to do it or not. I mean, and the good thing is it's there, at least it's there, all right? But you have to at some point, even if it's just, let's say we say form 1 and 2, you do Guyanese history, and then you switch to maybe social studies and then your Caribbean history or whatever.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think the issue with the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy and the 1899 arbitral award, that came out to, you know, every now and then when there is a threat, there is public consultation and awareness. And that was one of the recommendations that came out, that we should be teaching every aspect of Guyanese history, but more so about the controversy from nursery right up to university, because it helps us to be able to defend more our territory and to understand it and feel strongly about it.
Yes, and I mean, one of my colleagues at UG, Shemaine Joseph, she actually designed sort like a curriculum that could be used at these different stages, but everything quieted down and Venezuela is not a threat anymore, and so we don't care. And that's the thing about us, all right? There's no, we don't maintain anything. It happens and we're so reactive. We're not very proactive. So we react to it, and then everybody's saying not a blade of grass, and then we're happy and we move on, but that's the end of it.
Now let's talk about how you at the level of the university is helping to keep Guyanese history and history in general alive.
We're trying, and I must say that, you know, we're seeing some, and I guess one of the best things that ever happened is free tuition, because our numbers have increased tremendously. Even though people out there always have this idea that, oh, they don't do history at UG anymore, we are doing history. We always did history. We have an associate of history degree. We have a bachelor's of history degree, and they're ongoing. And we maintain that even when our numbers are very small, we still maintain and we still go through, because it is important that we do that. We also do these service courses for other faculties and so on in the university. And like I kind of alluded to earlier, that we are working on having history become one of the major or the compulsory service course, like the English service course, where every student, once you enter the university, you must take the history a history course before you, not a history course, a Guyanese history course, specifically Guyanese history course before you graduate. So we are working on that, and hopefully we get that implemented. If not 20, well, it looks like maybe 2027 academic year.
But we're happy it's in the pipeline. It's definitely needed in our institutions. And so before we leave, tell our viewers and our listeners where they could access your book from. How do you access it? What's the cost?
All right. So the book is available on Amazon. So you just type the name of the book. You type my name, Estherine Adams, or you type the name of the book, Slavery, Indentureship, and Women's Labor, and it will come up. It's available in different formats. There is a paperback, which is about 6,000 Guyana dollars, like $33 or something like that, I think. The what do you call it? The hardcover is about I think that's like about $90. But it's also going to be available in what do you call it? Ebook. Yes, in the ebook format on Kindle. So for your Kindle and your iPad and so on as well. So it's available on Amazon. It's also available at the University of University Press of Mississippi on their website as well. It's available there, but the most accessible because everybody's familiar with Amazon. So yes, so it's available on Amazon.
Thank you for such commendable work, for shining light and to giving a voice to those women whose stories were not told up until now. We appreciate you for that. And to those who are listening and viewing this program, thanks for joining us. I've been your host, Svetlana Marshall.